Hey there, Emmanuel here from WebDevFuel, and in today's video you're going to learn how to connect your Golang application to a PostgreSQL database. And also by the end of this video you're going to learn a secret on how to simplify your Golang code when interacting with your PostgreSQL database in order to avoid having to write a lot of boilerplate code. So if this sounds good, keep watching. As you can see, I went ahead and set up in here a very basic application with a router that we can go ahead and create books, get all of our books, and then also get a book by an ID. I also went ahead and created in here all of the functions to do all of those interactions with our database, but I left the database part out so you can go ahead and see exactly how you can connect this application to a PostgreSQL database. And also, just so you can understand our database structure, I went ahead and simply created in here a books table with an ID, a name, a description, and an author. Now, hopefully for us, Golang already comes inside of its standard library with a way for us to interact with SQL databases. So the only thing that we really need to do is to install a driver that is going to allow us to interact with Postgres specifically. So that's the first thing that we want to go ahead and do. So simply go ahead, navigate to your project root inside of your terminal, and then go ahead and type in here go get-u, and then simply go ahead and type github.com/lib and then /pq, and then press enter. And as you can see, this package was added to our project. Next, we want to be able to connect to our PostgreSQL database each time that we start our server. Start by first of all creating a new db.go file, and then inside of this file, start by typing in here package main. Now, because this is in here inside of our root folder, we can go ahead and define in here the main package, which is the same package that we are using inside of the other files. Next, let's start by importing our SQL package and then also the PostgreSQL driver that is going to allow us to interact with PostgreSQL. So start by typing in here import, and then you want to go ahead and import database and then SQL, which is again the standard, is part of the Golang standard library. And then we want to import, but make sure that we add in here the underline before our import string. And then again, we want to import github.com/lib/pq. Next, let's go ahead and define our database variable. And in order to do that, simply go ahead and type var and then db all capital letters. And then first of all, make sure you add in here an asterisk because this is going to be a pointer to a struct. And then go ahead and type in here sql.db. Next, let's go ahead and create a function that we're then going to be able to use it inside of our main.go file in order to open our connection to the database. So in order to do that, simply go ahead and type in here func to create a new function. And then let's go ahead and call this one open database. And then also let's go ahead and define the type that this is going to return, which is going to be an error. And then inside of here, go ahead and type the following. First, let's go ahead and initialize the error variable, which is a type error also. And then let's going to do the following. We want to type in here db and then comma error. And then this equals sql.open. And then here, the first parameter is going to be our driver name, which is in this case Postgres. And then the second parameter is going to be a connection string. So let's start by first of all passing in here our user key and value, which in my case is going to be Emmanuel. Then if you're using Linux or Windows, make sure you also pass the password key and value. And finally, let's go ahead and pass in here our database name, which in this case is going to be working with Go and Postgres. Now, again, if you're using this inside of your own project, make sure that you first of all have a database created and all of that stuff. I went ahead and did this before recording this video because this is besides the point of this video, but make sure that you have a database created and that you pass in here your database name. And finally, go ahead and also pass in here the key and value of SSL mode, which is going to be, in this case, disabled. So again, the key is SSL mode and the value needs to be disabled. Now we want to go ahead and handle this error right over here. And then if there's no error, we want to return nil. So again, if error is different than nil, which means that there's an error, we want to go ahead and return it. And if not, we want to go ahead and return nil. And finally, let's go ahead and define a function that is going to allow us to close our connection to the database each time that we shut down our server. Now, in order to do that, simply go ahead and also type in here func, and then let's call this one similarly to the previous function, close database. And then we also want to go ahead and return an error. And in here, we simply want to go ahead and return db.close. And now let's go ahead and open our database each time that we start our server. And in order to do that, we simply need to navigate to our main.go file, and in here inside our main function, let's first of all handle in here our error. And in here we simply want to type open database. So again, we're calling this function right here, and then the error is either going to be returned in here or we'll simply get back a nil value. And now let's go ahead and handle this nil value. So if error is different than nil, we want to go ahead and let ourselves know inside of the console that there was an error when connecting to our database, so we can know exactly what happened, and then we can go ahead and debug it. So in order to do that, let's start by simply typing log, then I'm going to press enter, and this is going to automatically import. If that is not the case for you, you can simply go ahead and manually import your log package. And then in here, let's simply type printf. And then here, let's pass a string, which we'll call error connecting to PostgreSQL database. And then we want to pass the error in here. So this is going to be replaced here by our error. And this is everything that we need in order to connect. And now let's go ahead and also make sure that we disconnect from the database. So we'll defer this function to the end after all of this runs. And then we want to simply go ahead and close our connection to the database. Now, to ensure that all of this works, let's go ahead and navigate back here to our root project folder, and let's simply go ahead and run our project. And as you can see, there is no errors because I already went ahead and again created the database, and the connection string is correctly set up. So we've successfully connected to our PostgreSQL database. Now let's go ahead and move back to our text editor and then navigate to our book.go file. So again, I went ahead and created in here 3 different functions, one where we can go ahead and create a new book, one where we can go ahead and read all of the books from our database, and finally one function that we can go ahead and simply read one book from our database based on its ID. Now, before we continue, I just realized that I forgot to add in here our offer, so I'm simply going to go ahead and also add in here the offer, and then also in here to make sure that there's no error when interacting with our database. Now, let's go ahead and start with the create function, and this one is actually going to be pretty simple. The first thing that you want to do is go ahead and type if error equals, and then in here, let's go ahead and access our DB variable. And in here, we simply want to use the query row method. And inside this method, we simply need to pass in here our SQL statement. Now we want to go ahead and create a new book. So we simply need to go ahead and insert into books. And then we want to insert a name, a description, and the offer. And then the values are going to be $1, $2, and then $3, because we want to go ahead then and pass in here all of these variables that we'll be able to access here from our body. So let's go ahead and do that. So first of all, we have our body.name, then we have our body.description, and finally our body.offer. Now at this point, we've already went ahead and queried our row. So now we want to make sure that we handle this statement and we know if we are returning actually an error or not, because again, we want to be able to handle this error. Now, in order to do that, we simply want to go ahead and use this error method in here because it is simply an alternative when we don't want to scan. And if you're not familiar with scanning, I'm going to explain in just a second. But for this case, we simply want to go ahead and add in here a dot and then the error method. And you want to make sure that you call it. Now let's go ahead and handle this error. So if the error is different than nil, we simply want to go ahead and type in here dub.write header, and then the status is going to, let's say, be internal server error. And for now, let's just return this and leave the log out, because you can go ahead and insert in here simply a log message as you wish to make sure that you know exactly what happened in here. So now let's go ahead and save this file and then navigate here back to our root project folder. And let's go ahead and start the server, so you can go ahead and make the request and make sure that this interacts with the database correctly. So now inside our HTTP client, let's go ahead and make a request to localhost port 3000/books. Also make sure this is the post method. And then let's go ahead and pass in here to the JSON object the name with the value, for example, the coolest book ever. Then the description is going to be empty and the offer is going to be web dev fuel. Now, in the case of the description, if you want, you can go ahead and make some kind of validation, but for this case, we can simply go ahead and leave it empty. So now, if we go ahead and press enter, as you can see, we've got back in here a 201 created, and this means that this all worked out. And now, if we move back here to our database client, and this client is already, as you can see here, connected to working with Go and Postgres. If we go ahead and refresh here, as you can see, this was now inserted into our database from our Golang code. Next, we want to go ahead and add the code that is going to allow us to get all of our books from the database. Now, in this case, this is going to be a bit harder because we are actually dealing with a list instead of just one item, but keep with me because this, after you understand exactly how this works, it is actually going to be pretty simple for you to understand. So the first thing that we want to go ahead and type in here is going to be rows. Then you want to add a comma and then error. And then we want to go ahead and type the following. So again, comma equals, and then we want to use the DB variable. And then in here, we want to go ahead and query. Now, instead of simply querying one row, we want to go ahead and query multiple rows. Now we want to go ahead and again select, let's say, the ID, the name, the description, and also the offer from our books table. And then in this case, we can simply go ahead and leave it as it is. Now, the first thing that we want to go ahead and do is we want to go ahead and handle this error. So if the error is different than nil, again, we can simply go ahead and do something like, let's write the header with the status code internal server, and then we can simply go ahead and return it. Now, the way this is going to work is we simply want to go ahead and iterate over all of these rows and then insert them into this books list right over here. Now, if this sounds confusing, here's exactly how we can go ahead and do this. So we simply want to go ahead and type in here for rows.next, which means that this is going to iterate over all of these rows that we have in here. And then for each one of the rows, we want to go ahead and do the following. We want to first of all define here a new book with type of book. And then we want to do the following. If r, equals rows.scan. So we are essentially scanning now each one of these rows into our book. And if you're not familiar with scanning, here's exactly how this works. We are simply going to go ahead and pass in here a value that is then going to be scanned into this type right over here. So we essentially want to pass in here a pointer to a value instead of a value directly. And then this is going to go ahead and modify the original value that we pass essentially in here, again, because this is a pointer to a value and not simply a value. Now, with that in mind, let's go ahead and scan this, and we need to make sure that this is in the same order that we get this back from our database, in the same order as we define in here all of our columns. So with that in mind, we simply want to go ahead and scan this into our book.id and then our book.name. and make sure that you pass in here this ampersand, because you need to make sure that you pass this in order to make sure that it is again a pointer to the value and not simply a value. And then do the same thing for the description and also for the offer. And now if the error is different than nil, again we want to return, and let's simply go ahead and copy this message right over here, so the status is the same. And now if there was no error, we simply want to go ahead and modify the original value here of books, and we want to simply go ahead and append this book into our books list. Now again, what's happening in here is that we are simply querying our database for multiple rows, and then for each one of the rows we simply need to create a new book type, because this is a list of books and this is simply one book. And then we want to go ahead, scan this into the book, and then because this is the same type as this one but this is simply a list, we can simply go ahead and append this to our books list, and then we are able to go ahead and read all of our books from the database. Now again, in order to make sure that this is working, let's go ahead and save our file. Let's move here back to our root project folder and let's restart the server. And now inside our HTTP client, instead of making this a post request, I'm simply going to make this a get request. And now let's also go ahead and delete in here all of our items. So let's delete actually the JSON that we went ahead and passed with the previous request. And now if we go ahead and make a request here to again localhost 3000/books, as you can see, we get back here. So let's make this a JSON text actually. And as you can see, we get an array with an object, because at this point we only have one value inside our database. And just to make sure that you understand, let's create in here, for example, another book, and let's also define in here the offer as web.fuel. And now if we go ahead and define, so failing row contains, okay, so we need to define in here an empty value. So let's make this one, for example, description. And now if we go ahead and save this in here, as you can see, we now have two different books. And now if we navigate back to our HTTP client and we make another request, as you can see, we now have two objects in here, one with the ID of 1 and then another one with the ID of 3, which means that we are now able to retrieve multiple items from our database. Finally, the last thing that we need to understand in order to interact with our PostgreSQL database from Golang is to get simply one item from the database. Now, in order to do that, again, in this function, we are simply grabbing in here our book ID so that we know which book ID the client is requesting, and then we can send it back. And then in here, we define a book variable. And now we want to go ahead, query our database and simply scan one row only. So in order to do that, let's again go ahead and type if err : equals, and then again, let's grab in here our database variable. And again, we want to go ahead and use simply one row. So for that case, we want to use this method, the query row. Now in here, let's go ahead and select the ID, name, description, and the offer from our books. And then we want to ensure that we are only grabbing one. So we'll say in here where ID equals $1. Now again, this variable needs to be the book ID that is currently being requested. So we want to make sure that we use in here this book ID that we grabbed from our router. So let's go ahead and pass this in here. And now instead of using this, so for this case right here, as you can see on the getAll function, we simply went ahead and used the query method, and then we iterated over each one of the rows. Now for this case, we simply went ahead and used, as you can see here, just the err method. But for this case, we want to do something different, which is going to be to directly scan this into again our variable right here. So again, keep in mind that for this case, we want to pass in here a pointer to a value, and then this is going to modify this original value. So we'll end up with our book that the client is requesting. So similar to before, let's go ahead and type in here book.id. And again, make sure that you have here the ampersand. and then book.name, then book.description, and book.offer, again in the same order that we get it back from our database. Now let's go ahead and handle this error. Let's go ahead and return it, and also copy this line and paste this in here to ensure that we know what the error is. Now if we go ahead and we save this file, we can go ahead and also navigate back to our project root folder, and let's go ahead, restart the server. And now inside our HTTP client, if we go ahead and make a request, but instead of simply requesting all of our books, we pass in here a ID. So let's say that, for example, we want this book right over here, which has the name of another book, the description is description, and the offer is web dev fuel. If we go ahead and make this request, as you can see, we now get back only an object with the values, with the key and the values of this book. And if we do the same thing here for book, for actually the ID number 1, as you can see, we get back here the same thing, but for the book with the ID number 1. And finally, just like I said at the beginning of this video, you're now going to learn a way for you to simplify your code and avoid having to first of all scan all of your table columns into a type or into a field, and then you're also going to learn how to avoid doing all of this dance right over here. So you're going to avoid having to first of all grab the rows, then iterate over each one of the rows. And in order to do that, we're going to use a very basic package that is going to help us to interact with our PostgreSQL database from Go in a much simpler way. Now, this is not an ORM, it is, let's say, a lower level abstraction over all of this stuff that Golang provides us, but it is a nice way for us to not have to write a lot of boilerplate code. So in order to do that, let's start by first of all installing this package. So let's go ahead and type go get -u and then github.com/jmoiron and then /SQLX. XQLX, just like that. So again, github.com/jmoiron/SQLX, and then press return. And as you can see, this package was just added to our project. Now let's go ahead and go back to our text editor and navigate to our db.go file. And inside of this file, what we essentially want to do is replace this package here that comes pre-installed, let's say, with Go. So it is part of the Go standard library. And we want to go ahead and replace this with this SQLX package. And then we also want to go ahead and modify here our DB value and also here open it using that particular package. So again, let's go ahead and type in here for github.com/jmoiron and then /SQLX. And let's also go ahead and delete that import from database /SQL. And then again, we want to replace this here and also this here. And now if we go ahead and save this, as you can see, there are no errors, and that's because this package allows us to simply add another layer on top of database SQL. So what essentially happens is that this database, if we now go ahead and let's say that we go ahead and start our server, and let's go ahead and move back here to our HTTP client. If you go ahead and make a request, as you can see, all of this still works. If we also go ahead and request all of our books, this still works. And the reason for that is because this package simply provides an abstraction over the database SQL package that comes pre-installed again with Golang, and it simply provides more methods for us to interact with the database in a simpler way. Now, the useful part about this is that we don't have to rewrite a lot of our code, and if you currently are using PostgreSQL or if you want to migrate from the Go standard library into this package, so if you want to start using this package, you can start incrementally changing stuff, and as you can see, we've changed this in here and all of our code still works. Now let's go ahead and use this package to actually simplify our code. So let's go ahead and delete this entire for loop because we're not going to be needing it anymore. So we can go ahead and delete it, and also we want to go ahead and delete these rows and the comma part. and we can simply go ahead and instead of handling in the next line the error, we can simply go ahead and type in here if the error is different than nil. We can go ahead and copy this code, this block of code, and then we can also go ahead and delete this stuff right over here. And now in here, as you can see, we still have an error, and that's because we need to go ahead and replace this method right here. Now the method that we need is, instead of using query, we want to go ahead and use this select method. Now what this select method is going to allow us to do is to simply pass in here, first of all, our variable that a pointer again to our variable, where we want to then go ahead and grab all of these values. So again, we want to have all of these values read, and then we simply want to go ahead and point this to something, which is going to be here our books list. So in order to do that, let's go ahead and simply type in here ampersand and then books. And as you can see, this simplifies our code very much. Again, what we simply want to do is pass in here, first of all, so the first parameter is going to be, as you can see in here, an interface. So in this case, it can be any kind of type. So we simply want to pass in here our books, and then we're going to select here our ID, the name, the description, the author, and the author from our books table. And then this is going to go ahead and grab all of our rows and do all of that stuff automatically for us. Now keep in mind that this select method is only going to be used when you want to select multiple columns. And to make this stuff also work but for only one column, let's go ahead and modify here our get function. And in here, similarly to the case before, instead of having this query row and then having to scan all of this manually, we can simply go ahead and delete this entire code of block, so this entire part of our line actually. And then let's go ahead and replace this part right over here, which reads query with get. And then just like we did before, before passing in here our SQL statement, we need to pass a pointer to our variable that we want to modify with the values that we get back from our database. And as you can see, as simple as that, we went ahead and simplified our Golang code that interacts with our PostgreSQL by a lot, by simply having this very simple package that is very, very powerful, and again allows us to simplify our code, especially in this case on the get all, because if you recall, let's just go back. As you may remember, as you can see, we have here an entire block of code that is very, let's say, manual to do, very laborious, and we have to write a lot of boilerplate code in order to accomplish it. And in here also the same thing. Let's say that you didn't only have, let's say, the ID, the name, the description, and the author, and you had a bunch of different columns. You would have to go ahead and type all of this manually. But with this package, you don't need to do none of that stuff. You can simply go ahead and pass in here your variable, then this variable is going to have a type, and then you'll have access to all of these values directly inside of this variable. And inside of this list, the same thing, we simply need to use again the select method, and we can access all of our books in a very simple way. So hopefully you now know exactly how to connect your Golang application to a PostgreSQL database. So let me know in the comments below what you thought of this video, if this was helpful or not to you. If it was helpful, leave a like below, and also subscribe to get notified of future content, because I'm going to post more stuff about Golang in the future.